If you think cemeteries are quiet at night, think again. I grew up treating the stones like a second backyard, thin light, older trees, and more privacy than any park. I never imagined those rows of headstones would teach me how small I really was. When I was in high school, the cemetery behind the old mill was ours. Not legally ours, obviously, just ours in the way teenagers claim places. By showing up, by knowing which bench didn't have a spiderweb, by daring each other to sit in the churchyard after dark. It wasn't horror movies or ghost stories that pushed us there at first. It was boredom, the kind that smells like motor oil and cheap beer, and the need to get away from parents and the homework that never ends. We were kids trying to invent courage. There were 3 of us, me, my 2 best friends, and we had a habit of bringing someone to impress. Sometimes it was a girl from school who liked the way the wind made our jackets flap. Sometimes no one came except the moon and a couple of packs of gum. The night Jane came was the night the cemetery stopped feeling like a playground and started feeling like a place with edges. Jane had this old soul look to her, quiet but not shy, like she paid attention to things you overlooked. We met near the crumbling fence, where the iron posts were bent and mossed. The cemetery rolled away from the road in a field of worn stones and untrimmed grass. Beyond the far row of graves, there was a copse of trees, and tucked in those trees was an old church people whispered about, but almost never went to. If you picture it now, imagine a small white building that had been white once. The paint had peeled in long vertical strips, and the steeple leaned like it was listening to something on the wind. There was a rusted chain across the doors. Old churches like that carry sound differently. Even a laugh felt like an intrusion. I remember the smell, wet wood, mildew, a sweetness like something long dead had been left in the sun. We pushed at that chain because doing nothing felt like a confession of cowardice. We were stupid in the way teenagers are stupid, testing lines, seeing what would crack first, our bravado or the building. I say we pushed to avoid the details I regret. The point is, the door moved enough for us to get inside. It was darker than we expected and blew colder breath on our faces like the inside of a mouth. Inside, long pews sat in rows, their varnish eaten away by time. A beam of moonlight cut through a hole in the roof and made a pale bar across the dust. Someone had smashed a stained glass window on the far side. The shards made tiny constellations underfoot. The floorboards were old. They creaked as if whispering secrets every time someone stepped. Jane lagged a few steps behind, tracing the carved edges of the altar with a finger. She leaned over the pulpit like she expected a sermon to start again. I think that was what made me feel so invincible, because it felt like a stage, and we were the main act. I don't have any right to call it courage. It was curiosity and something else, an appetite for the unknown. We moved forward, lanterns and phone lights cutting cones into the dark. At the center of the nave, the floor had a different feel. The wood there was grey and soft around our shoes, like the difference between a rotten peach and the firm one beside it. I stepped forward too quickly. The floor gave. 1 second I was stomping to show off, the next I was falling. You expect falling to be a single moment, free and quick. This wasn't that. It was like being swallowed in layers. My shoulder hit splinters, stones scraped against my back, a sound metallic and sick when my ribs met something sharp. I felt a breath of cold air rush from beneath me, and then everything went wrong. I landed on rock, not a gentle pile of dirt or old boards, but cold, sharp rock 10 feet below the church floor. The light from above was a narrow ring. My phone, miracle of miracles, was still in my hand. It was bent at an angle that made the screen look like a fisheye mirror. I coughed. I tasted dust and something metallic on my tongue. What I remember as soon as I could breathe was the ladder. It was broken, remnants of rungs and a splintered spine clinging to the side of the hole. Whoever had been down there before had tried to escape or had been stuck and failed. The way the ladder lay said one thing loud and clear: it couldn't be trusted. Then I heard it. A sound at the edge of the darkness, movement that didn't belong to the building, something shifting, like a heavy thing dragged over stone, a grunt, a wet cough. I told myself it was the wind. I told myself my friends were laughing. I told myself 1,000 things because I was falling into a hole with a broken ladder and something else was down there. Sounds insane when you try to describe it cleanly. I shined my light along the walls. I called up. My friends' faces hovered in the bright circle from their phones. They had their hands pressed to their mouths, shadows making their eyes black. One of them, Tom, threw down a branch. It thudded against the lip of the hole and bounced off into the dark. He used it to try and reach me. People do strange things when they're scared. Sometimes they become helpful, and sometimes they become panicked and useless all at once. The branch landed and skittered to a stop within arm's reach. My fingers closed around it. It was splintered and cold. I braced the bottom of my hands against the earthen lip and heaved. The branch shook. I felt the grain of the wood burn my palms. I pulled, and the hole answered with a new sound, a low, ugly rasp, like someone clearing their throat from way down there. My light caught something shining. It was a bald head. The flashlight hit the crown, and the light bounced off like a coin. Eyes reflected. You'd expect a face when you fall into something. But the way that head moved, slow animal low to the ground, made every part of me catalogue fear. He crawled, not stood, not walked. He came on hands and knees, like someone making themselves smaller, or like they couldn't stand up for some reason. His shoulders were raw with dirt. There was a smell that hit me then, something stale, sweat and ground, and something I couldn't put my finger on. The thing that made my stomach drop was the way he looked up. His eyes found me and stayed. Angry, empty, focused. I screamed, a dry sound that did nothing to me. The man crawled toward the light. He moved under the smashed window's broken moonbeam, and the shine on his skull made him look less human for a second, like a statue come loose. He opened his mouth and made a sound. I still can't say whether it was a word or a grunt. My friends threw down another branch. This one landed harder, closer to his path. For a moment he froze, head cocked, as if listening for the chain of his name. Someone above said urgently, "Go, go, now!" The command was less for me and more for themselves. Fear makes people direct. We used the branch like a lever. People think branches are magical in crises, useful because they feel like control. They heaved. I climbed, and when I crawled back through the hole, I felt like I'd left a piece of myself behind in the dark. My breath, my composure, the part that believed things had tidy explanations. From the doorway of the church, we watched him. He didn't follow us out. Instead, he retreated, sliding back over the stones and disappearing behind a pillar where the moon didn't touch. We could see the outline of his shoulders for a second, and then he was gone, like someone stepped off stage when the lights hit the audience. We bolted. We ran past the leaning steeple, through the trees, breathing hard enough to taste iron. The cemetery felt enormous and crowded with eyes. We didn't stop until we hit the main road, and I remember sitting on the curb, legs shaking, not making sense of the way adrenaline made your hands numb and hot at the same time. For days after, I couldn't sleep. Guilt was a steady undercurrent. It wasn't just fear. I kept thinking about the man in the hole, about the ladder, about the way that head reflected light. Guilt because we had forced the place, because we had left. We told ourselves we had done the responsible thing, escaped, and yet it felt like running away from someone who couldn't defend themselves. 2 days later, I walked back alone. I know how that reads. It was stupid. It was shameful. Everyone who reads this will pick their own word for it. I went back because something about an unresolved thing, especially one you helped cause, keeps nagging. Maybe I wanted to see that the man was safe. Maybe I wanted to make sure he wasn't. Maybe I wanted to punish myself. The church sat like it had been waiting. Moonlight from that afternoon made the broken glass look less like stars and more like teeth. I knelt at the edge of the hole and looked down. The branch was there, lying on the floor where it had fallen. The ladder pieces were the same ruin, but the crawling man was gone. There was no sign of a struggle. There were no footprints leading away, only a faint smear in the dirt that might have been a handprint or might have been a thing blurred by rain. I climbed down, slowly this time, without bravado, and touched the stone where he'd rested. It was cold. Everything was cold. The hole breathed up at me like a mouth waiting for a story and wouldn't give one. I told a friend, later, not that night, about the branch. He laughed weakly, said maybe we'd imagined things, maybe. But when I went home there was a weight in my chest I hadn't felt before, a knowledge that something in that place had noticed us the way a hunter notices a careless rabbit. I started paying attention to the way people looked at me afterward, to the way some older folks would glance toward the church when we walked past. I never found out who the man was. Nobody filed a report about him. There were no missing person notices stuck on the grocery store bulletin board. He became a rumor I couldn't place, a thing that might be human and might not. The not knowing is worse than a solution. With a solution, at least, you could move on. With not knowing, you keep replaying the moment your lights caught someone else's eyes and decided that person didn't matter enough. Looking back, that night was when a line shifted for me. Teen bravado gives way to the first long, cold shadow of adult anxiety. We thought we could contain danger like a joke. We were wrong. The cemetery wasn't just a place to hide or make out or get away from parents for an hour. It was a place where the ground kept stories and where sometimes those stories reached back. If you're the kind of person who stays for this sort of thing, hit like and subscribe. There are more stories coming. I won't fill this channel with flash and scream. I prefer them slow, like the kind that curl up in your chest at 2 in the morning. I say that, but I also want to be clear. I don't recommend anyone go poking into old buildings or trespassing for thrills. That night changed me in ways I couldn't have foreseen. If you're ever in a place where you feel unsafe, the sensible thing is to leave and tell someone. Looking back doesn't mean I made the right choices. Years later, the cemetery would find its way back into my life in a softer, quieter way. My grandmother died when I was 22. She'd been the kind of woman who could knit you a sweater and complain about the weather at the same time. Her funeral was the kind of small-town affair where the preacher remembers your name and people talk about casseroles for a week. After the funeral, I started going to the grave in the afternoons, not because I wanted to dwell, but because the cemetery was one of the few places that felt steady. Visiting her felt normal, an errand, a place to set down flowers and the messy, practical things grief demands. The headstone was a simple slab, her name softened by lichen. I found a rhythm in the ritual, a walk down the path, a brush of my fingers along the cool stone, a private conversation I mostly mouthed. The first time I saw her, the woman who would become the second chapter of this story, she was several graves over, her hands folded in front of her like a shape that didn't quite fit the rest of the day. She had the look of someone who'd been at the cemetery before, clothes in layers, hair tucked under a cap, a voice that carried when she spoke to herself. At first I thought she was another mourner. Later I realized she wasn't there for anyone I knew. She spoke aloud to a grave I hadn't noticed before. She said a name, George. She said it with that particular tenderness people reserve for spouses or children. Her voice was loud enough that a couple of birds flushed. She turned when she saw me and smiled like we'd bumped into each other in a grocery store. "It's time to go," she told the grave. Then, as if that explained the whole world. The first time I heard that line, it pricked the same place in me that the church had months earlier. It was small things adding up, tiny landmarks of unease. She started showing up more often, always nearby my grandmother's stone. Sometimes we would speak. She had a way of leaning in close, as if she wanted me to catch what she was saying, like it was a secret meant only for me. Her conversation moved from polite to oddly intimate. She knew where I lived. She knew my schedule more precisely than I felt comfortable admitting while standing in a place that smelled like cut grass and old prayers. The line between someone being neighborly and someone being too interested is thin. She crossed it and kept walking. I told myself it was coincidence. People make their own maps, and sometimes two maps overlap. But then she started greeting me by name. Not from across the cemetery, not from a distance. She would look up from kneeling and say, clear as a bell, "Hey, Jake, it's me." My name in her mouth sounded rehearsed, like a line learned at the wrong time. From the beginning, there was an intimacy that felt wrong. She lingered near my grandmother's stone, even when I wasn't there. She would sit on the bench, talk aloud to empty air, and then glance at me if I passed. Once she asked about the house I had grown up in a way that made me uncomfortable. I told her simple facts, the kind you hand over when you don't want to get deeper: address, the fact that it had windows on two sides, the rooms filled with the same mismatched furniture that used to be in my grandmother's living room. That night, as I left, I felt watched. Not the everyday observation of someone living in a small town. This was focused, like someone was reading the margin notes of my life. I didn't think much of it at the time. Grief makes you sloppy with caution. You let things slide you wouldn't otherwise. You give small confidences away to fill an ache. Then came the night she was in my house. I didn't go into detail here before, because it's hard to describe the way a home is violated without sounding theatrical. The point isn't that something violent happened, nothing like that, but that the line between my private self and the world had been crossed. I came home late after helping a friend move boxes. The porch light was on. My stomach sank with every step. The front door was unlocked. I froze at the threshold, breath shallow, and saw a figure on the couch. She was there, head bent, talking to herself the way people who are grieving sometimes do. I found myself walking into my own living room as if into a dream. She looked up at me and smiled like she was the one inconvenienced. "It's time to go," she said to no one, and then to me, as if it were normal, "Oh, you're back. Sorry. I thought you were George." She was sitting where my grandmother's favorite chair had been. On the end table beside her was a frame with a photograph. A picture of me that had been on the mantel since I was little. One of those school photos where the hair is wrong and the grin is forced. I don't know why she took it. I don't know what she wanted with it. She didn't look like someone who wanted to hurt anyone. She looked like someone who had decided she needed a place to rest and had chosen mine. When she left, later, through the back window she had somehow opened, the photograph was gone. Nothing else in the house had been touched. No valuables missing. Just that small rectangle of my face. I called the police. They came, polite and methodical, and took notes that made it all feel more official and more unreal at the same time. They said she might have been grieving someone with the same name, George, a grave wrong for her sense of loss, and that sometimes people get mixed up. They said they would look into it. The report sat on a desk, a piece of paper that declared a thing had happened and didn't explain why. After the police left, my house felt smaller. The place a photograph takes on a wall is part of what shapes your day. Without that tiny frame, the mantel was bare, and my house looked like a stage with a missing prop. I didn't tell a lot of people. Part of me was ashamed that I'd been tricked into stepping aside while a stranger made herself at home in my life. Part of me was angrier. Part of me kept replaying what she'd said. "Hey, Jake, it's me." She knew my name. She knew where I lived, whether she had a claim on grief that bled into my life, or whether she had followed me, or whether something else entirely was at play, I couldn't say. The only certain thing was how small and exposed I felt. That's where I want to stop for a moment, because it matters that these stories don't close neat loops. The church swallowed me and refused to spit me out with answers. The woman took something of mine and left without explanation. Both times the cemetery was the doorway, the place that blurred what belonged to the living and what didn't. I started taking my walks less for him and more to see who else would appear. The cemetery became a watch point rather than a refuge, and like all creeping things, the discomfort metastasized into a persistent awareness. I began to notice footsteps when there shouldn't be, the silhouette of someone behind a tree when no one had walked by. I watched faces a little longer. I slept with the light on sometimes, which, given my personality, was a signal that something about the world had shifted. When I spoke to my mother about it months later, I was expecting her to roll her eyes and tell me to stop living in the past. Instead, she looked at me with that small, tired expression people have when they remember something they'd been trying to tuck away. She said she'd seen someone once, years before, someone who had come to her with a stitched-together story about a lost man named George. She'd called the police then, back when my grandmother was still alive, and the memory of that man had sat like a stone in her throat. Hearing my mother say it was the same pattern, name recital, wrong grave, a person who didn't quite fit, made my skin crawl in a different way. It wasn't just me. I wasn't inventing a pattern out of loneliness. There was an echo, an overlapping of experience. That realization was the first time the fear moved from the personal to the communal. It suggested a chain rather than a fluke. I should stop here for now, because the rest of what came next twists into something that isn't just about a stolen photograph or a man in a hole. It becomes about names, about how people remember you, and about how some things follow you even when you move away. It becomes about hearing your name in the dark and not knowing who is saying it or why. But before I move on, because there is more and because this is why you're here, there's one last thing I want you to keep in mind. Cemeteries are not neutral. They are full of lives on hold and words unspoken. They are places people visit to practice saying goodbye, and places other people go to practice being someone else. In my case, both were true, and neither led to anything comfortable. I still walk past the old church sometimes in daylight, and I check the ground around the stones when the wind is right. I look for the branch we used, for that rotten ladder, for any sign of the man who crawled toward the beam. The thing is, finding or not finding him wouldn't make me feel any safer. Knowing doesn't always save you. Sometimes it just gives you a better picture of what you lost. What happened next moved me into a different kind of watchfulness, one that didn't start with adolescent dares, but with the simple, unglamorous terror of being known. The next encounter would make that clear in a way the church never had. It would show how long these things can linger, like silt settling in a jar, until they become indistinguishable from the water itself. I moved into the little house that backed up against the cemetery because it made sense at the time. It was cheap. It was close to work. It had a back porch where I could drink coffee in the dark and watch the graves at dawn. On paper, it was poetic. The living sleeping next to the dead, and for a while it felt like that. Early on, I told myself the proximity was part of the comfort. I liked knowing my grandmother's headstone was a 5-minute walk away. I liked the way the property line rustled in the wind, how the trees made a steady, private noise in the night. The first few months were ordinary. I planted a single flower bed, fixed a squeaky hinge, learned where the raccoons liked to raid the trash. At night, when work finished and the city settled into the smaller hum, I would go for walks along the rim of the cemetery. These were not reckless trespasses into the dark anymore. They were deliberate, small rituals, an evening to let the day loosen its hands from my shoulders. Sometimes I read, sometimes I walked, sometimes I thought about nothing. It was one of those nights, not long after I'd moved in, that I first heard my name spoken softly from the dark between two headstones. The cemetery was nearly empty. A lamppost on the far end gave the graves a washed-out, indifferent light. I remember the air, cold in the way that makes your breath look temporary. Leaves whispered. My footsteps were a dry sound on the gravel. "Hey, Jake, it's me." At first I thought someone I knew, a neighbor taking a late stroll, maybe a friend from work. I turned, expecting a familiar face, and saw a man standing by a tree. He was lit from one side by the lamplight and wore sunglasses. It was strange. Late, low light, sunglasses. He looked ordinary until he didn't. His posture was calm, like someone waiting for a bus. He had a long coat that moved with no sound. "Do I know you?" I asked, "because that's what you do when someone knows your name and you don't know them." He smiled, the kind of thin smile people practice for photos. "It's me," he said again. No elaboration, no explanation. He took a step forward. The movement made me realize his hands were empty. His gait had a slight limp, a hitch that didn't match the rest of him. He didn't seem threatening. He didn't seem to be trying to. That was the worst part. I did what I'd learned to do after the woman in my house. I kept things light and small. "Sorry, man, you must have me confused with someone else." He blinked. "No," he said. "Jake." He said it like he'd been rehearsing the cadence of my name, like he'd practiced saying it in the mirror. It wasn't shouting, it wasn't a demand. It was a piece of information, like he was reciting my postal code. The familiarity of the tone made my skin tighten. I couldn't put a reason to it. I began. He stepped back just a little, and the lamplight slid across the left side of his face. There was something wrong about how his jaw moved. Not broken, not human exactly. I felt my mouth do the polite thing and say, "Nice night," like small talk could smooth the whole thing over. He nodded at me almost gently and walked away down the path that led deeper between the stones. When he was gone, I let myself breathe the way you do after holding your breath in a narrow place. I told myself it was over. Maybe he was a grieving person who had been told I was a contact. Maybe he'd been saying my name to someone else, and I'd just happened to be within earshot. The brain is generous with explanations when they keep you safe. That dread didn't follow me home that night. It sat at the edge of my thoughts like a small animal that might scamper at any careless movement. I slept poorly, with a low light on. I tried not to imagine what it would be like to wake up with someone standing at the foot of my bed, reading my name from memory. A week later, I saw him again. This time it was later, around 2 in the morning, and I was walking the narrow track that ran along the southern border of the cemetery. The moon had been swallowed by a cloud, and every shadow felt like a person pausing. I heard twig snaps, subtle, intentional, and turned because I didn't want to be the last person to turn in, a place where people told you not to be alone. He was there, half hidden behind an old oak, the collar of his coat raised as if to hide his face. No sunglasses now. The lamplight from the road crept over him and made his skin look oddly waxen. He stepped out from the tree without hurry, like he'd been waiting for me to notice. He smiled, and the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Thought I'd find you," he said. "Do I know you?" I asked again. His head tilted. "You do now," he said. He reached a hand out to touch my shoulder. It was a quick contact, nothing theatrical, just a touch at the top of the shoulder, like someone tapping your arm to get your attention. The hand felt as if he'd been doing hard work with it. It was caked in something dark, a crust that could have been dirt or rust or dried blood. I felt it even before I saw it. The fingers pressed, then left. The cold seeped through my jacket like a hand had pulled the heat from the air. I turned away and ran, because that's what the body remembers first. Instinct outruns thought. My feet found the path. I didn't stop until I reached the lamp-lit curve where the cemetery met the road. I leaned over the hood of my car and tried to pretend air would steady me. My lungs were hot and angry. My shirt was damp. I called my mother on the way home because that's the reflex you don't always admit. Call someone who knows you and will take you seriously. I told her, in pieces, that a man had been following me, that he had said my name. She listened in the way people do when they've heard enough to know they shouldn't laugh. "That's the man," she said quietly into the phone. "What man?" I asked, because I needed more than a hint to fit around the dire shape of what she said. "The man I told you about," she said, "when I was younger." Her voice thinned in the middle like someone walking through fog. "He came to me too. Said a name, wrong grave. I thought it was just—" She stopped and didn't finish the sentence because some memories don't like being spoken. Hearing her say it was the same name, the same pattern, turned the fear into something heavier, something that didn't belong only to me. It suggested that this was more than accidental coincidence. Or it suggested a coincidence so precise it made the head spin. We did the things people in small towns do when the odd becomes a pattern. My mother called a neighbor who'd been on the police board years ago. I called a non-emergency number to ask for advice. Officers came by sometimes and walked the perimeter. They didn't stay, they never did. They asked questions, took a statement, scribbled, no arrests, no long-term stakeout. The man left no trace except traces of his presence on me. The memory of the touch, the image of the sunglasses in lamplight, the tone he used when he spoke my name. The more visibly I tried to ignore it, the more the world made room for its unease. I stopped leaving the backlight on. I started checking locks 3 times. I moved good knives closer to where I slept, which is to say I became the kind of person who could no longer pretend walls were enough. Then the encounters changed in a way that wasn't incremental. They intensified not by volume, but by specificity. He began to say things that couldn't be mistaken for accident. Small sentences aimed at me, as if he had been living in the margins of my home. "You left the light on," he said once when I returned from the store, standing at the edge of the yard as if he'd been watching the house's angles. "The window by the kitchen." I remember the way the words slotted into the evening like a hinge clicked the wrong way. Another night he stood by the fence and called, "Hey, Jake, it's too late to go now, isn't it?" He said it like he was offering me a continuity I didn't want. I felt like an actor being read my lines by an audience member. The strangest, most invasive moment came when I found a scrap of paper pinned to the inside of my back gate. It was small, cut from something, not ripped like a note. On it, in a steady, careful hand, was written, "You're quieter when you talk to the stones." I couldn't tell if it was meant to alarm me, to mock me, or to comfort me. I couldn't tell if the hand that wrote it had loved someone with the name George, or if it had been practicing to talk to me. I put the paper in a drawer and didn't tell anyone. Keeping things in a drawer is a private way of admitting you are being watched. The oddest part of all of it was something I couldn't place, the way people around me started to behave like they'd been nudged. A mail carrier lingered at the gate, as if gauging my reaction. Once, a neighbor hammered on my door to ask if I'd seen a man he'd noticed at the edge of the cemetery. He described someone with a certain limp and a coat and, oddly, an absence of return address on his life, as though the world had translated the man into language and found the words inadequate. As weeks turned into a disquieting kind of season, the man appeared with a consistency that felt like him mapping my routines. He never followed me home from work. He rarely came during the day. He appeared at edges and in slivers of dark when he could see me by light or shadow. He always said my name. Sometimes he'd add a detail. "You should fix that step, it wobbles." That made my skin crawl because it was true. Other times he'd say nothing. He seemed to collect small facts the way some people collect stamps. Once I tried to confront him. It was reckless in the flat, useless way that makes you feel like you're taking action. I walked to the fence with a flashlight and called out, "Who are you? What do you want?" The beam of my light trembled in my hand. The man was standing in the hollow by the old yew, half hidden, as if he'd been waiting for me to make a spectacle of myself. He came forward without hurry. Up close, his face looked older than it had from the road. His eyes were a strange, pale color in which the iris and the sclera almost traded places. He smiled like a man who had been forgiven. "You remember," he said. "You remember the coffee on Sunday. You remember the curtain." It was nonsense and memory at the same time, as if he were stitching his sentences from things he had observed and things he had invented. I felt ridiculous and dangerous at once, like a boy confronting a story that has fixed itself to you. "Why do you keep saying my name?" I asked. He touched the fence, ran a finger along the wood, and said, "Names are how you stay with people, even when they're gone." He said it like a fact. It sounded almost tender. At that moment, something in me that wanted to be reasonable stepped forward. "Do you know my grandmother?" I asked. "Did you come here for her? For George?" He tilted his head. "George," he said, tasting the name. "Yes, sometimes. Sometimes the name is that. But names move around. People take names. They sit in them like chairs." It was the vaguest, most infuriating answer imaginable. I wanted to be angry. I'd spent nights with a radio, whispering in the corner, and a lamp on like a small, defiant sun. I had been watched. I had been touched. Someone had written secret notes and left them for me to find. I wanted to call the police. I wanted to trap this man in a narrative that had an end. But when he left, when he turned and walked back toward the deeper rows of the graves, he did so without haste, as if he were retracing his own steps in an old and very private habit. When I told my mother about that encounter, she sighed the way someone does when recounting a family curse. "He approached me once," she said. "I was young. I was in a cemetery by the highway. He told me a story about a man named George who had been lost. I called the police." Her voice turned thin and sharp at that memory. "They never found him." "Did you give a description?" I asked. "Sure," she said. "I told them what I could. Dark coat, gait, but when they looked, nothing fit. People change. Memory is fickle." But there was a weight under her words, a belief that something had been there, and that something had been missed. The idea that he might be human persisted. He could be a man with mental illness drifting between graves, mistaken names clutching to him like scarves. That would be an ugly truth, but one that could be dealt with by calling authorities and seeking help for him. The other possibility, that there was something else, was harder to accept because you can't call social services for a thing that isn't quite human. I tried to put iron in my life. I kept the porch light on. I installed motion sensors on the back, not because I wanted them to catch a ghost, but because they gave me a reason to believe surveillance could help. The sensors handled the small animals well. They flashed lights and tripped my reflexes. They offered the illusion of control. One night, though, the illusion failed. It was late again, later than late. My sleep had thinned like the paper you attempt to patch a hole with. I couldn't rest. I stepped out with a mug of coffee that had gone cold between the kitchen and the porch. The fog had come in from the field, and the cemetery looked like a city of low, blurred monuments. I put my mug on the rail and heard a sound behind me, the sound of someone on the back step. I turned, and there he was, a silhouette carved into the fog, standing further into the yard than I'd ever allowed anyone. He didn't hurry. He didn't say anything at first. He walked up to the rail where my mug sat and looked at it, then at me, then past me, like someone checking to see if the story matched the set. Slowly, he walked around the porch and came up beside me. He was close enough that I could see the texture of his skin. Up close, his hand, when he raised it, not to touch me this time, but to point at the mug, was a study in contradiction. The nails were dirty. The knuckles had old scars. The skin between the fingers had a fine webbing of dried substances that refused to make themselves into meaning. He touched nothing. He just stood there and frowned at the coffee. "You drink that without sugar," he said. "You always did." The sentence could have been a memory or a fabrication stitched from a single observation. I hadn't told anyone about the coffee habit. "How do you know that?" I asked, voice tight, because reasons are a way we keep the world from sliding. He turned to me then, very slowly. "I know because names belong to people, and people belong to names." He smiled like someone telling a long joke. "You came back. You always come back." I felt the world tilt inward in a way I can only call vertiginous. I had told no one my habit of cold washing a dinner-time coffee on the porch. I had not announced to the street that I liked my coffee this way. There was no plausible, non-creepy explanation that fit without stretching my imagination into a different shape. After that night, I stopped pretending to be brave. I stopped leaving things on the rail. I started carrying my phone in my hand whenever I stepped into the yard. I kept my curtains half closed so I could see the graves through the glass without being seen. I asked neighbors casual, careful questions about anyone moving through the cemetery at odd hours. People nodded and said they had seen folks, a figure in a coat here, a shadow there. No one liked to spend much time talking about it. You could feel them closing that chapter of conversation like a book that bristles when opened in the wrong light. In the middle of all this, I did something I should have done sooner. I reached out to someone professionally. Not the kind of professionals who show up once and file a report, but someone who understands patterns. I spoke with a counselor who worked with families dealing with grief and with people who'd had persistent anxiety about being followed. I wanted to make sense, to give myself vocabulary that wasn't panic. It helped, a little. The counselor suggested boundary work, safety planning, and practical things. It also suggested something I hadn't thought of. Document everything. Notes, dates, times, details. If this was a person who could be helped or stopped, then records mattered. I started keeping a small notebook. It felt silly at first, writing down the time a man said my name, but it also felt practical, like making the world legible again. The notebook filled with small entries. October 12th, 2 a.m., seen by you, said, "It's me." October 18th, touch shoulder, caked hand. November 1st, note on gate, "You're quieter when you talk to the stones." The notebook became proof that something consistent was happening. It made me braver enough to walk to the edge of the cemetery with a neighbor one afternoon when the light was good. We did not find him. We found only the small markers and the frost on the grass and the sympathetic way winter had leveled things. It was disappointing and terrifying at the same time. The other night, the last one I can tell you about, he came closer than he had before. I suppose that's the real fear in all of this. Not the mere presence of a stranger at the perimeter, but the thought that the perimeter itself might be a porous thing that you think is solid until some hand tests it and finds it complaining. It was raining steady and thin. I had left the porch light on, a pale halo. I was inside making something that wasn't dinner when I heard a faint knock on the back window. I went over, heart racing, and peered out. He stood at the edge of the yard like a statue that had decided to become a person for a second. Rain made his coat cling. His hair was damp. He looked at me directly. "Jake," he said, "you can stop pretending the cemetery's quiet." I opened the door despite everything that said not to. He did not come into the house. He stood on the edge of the porch and looked at me with that half-apologetic expression some people wear when they're about to say something cruel and call it kindness. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. "Who are you?" He studied me like a man trying to remember a song. "I am a listener," he said finally. "I keep the names warm until they find their owners. That's all." He smiled then, and there was a kindness there that made me stagger. Not because it was believable, but because it didn't fit anywhere I'd imagined. "Are you dangerous?" I asked, the question heavy and almost childish. He made a small sound that could have been a laugh. Sometimes the living are dangerous, sometimes the dead are. It depends on whose hands are hungry that night. I remember walking back into the kitchen and locking the door. Part of me wanted to call someone again. Part of me wanted to put the man into a category that would let me sleep. But some categories were missing. The police could do things, the neighbors could look out, but none of them could account for a man who said my name like it was a thing he cherished, and then called me a liar for thinking he was simple. After he left that night, I told my mother everything in a single breath. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not have a tidy answer. She only did something practical. She brought out a shoebox from her closet, old and soft at the corners. Inside there were scraps of newspaper, a photograph, a folded note. She handed them to me. "This," she said, "was from when I told someone about a man who'd been near the church. I kept a clipping. I kept the note the officer wrote down." The photograph showed her, years younger, sitting on a bench in a park with a man blurred in the background. The note had a scribbled description. It was not conclusive. It was not a map. But it was evidence that this pattern had existed before I was aware of it. Her voice trembled when she said, "I thought I had imagined it. I thought it was grief wearing a suit." Hearing the scratch of ink on paper, the way my mother had once become the kind of witness who keeps things because they might be important later, lessened my loneliness. It also deepened the chill. The fact that this had brushed across generations meant it wasn't just about me being paranoid. It meant there was a history you could not simply step away from. There are nights now when I stand in the kitchen and look out the window at the headstones lit by the streetlight, and wonder what it is we're keeping each other from saying. Are we, the living, being watched because we carry names that make sounds men remember? Or is something else collecting the syllables of our lives because it cannot hold its tongue? I still go to the cemetery sometimes, though less often and always in daylight. It is an errand now, rather than a refuge. I leave flowers on my grandmother's stone, but I don't linger at the edges. I watch people who watch me. I keep the notebook close, and I tell friends when something happens. Sometimes telling it aloud makes it nonsense, and sometimes it makes it sharper, like a drawn picture. The man with the sunglasses appears intermittently. He never stays where you can catch him long enough to learn the story behind his coat. He has become a shape at the margins of my life, an outline I recognize the way you recognize a scar on your palm. He knows my name. He steals small pieces of certainty by using it. He touches the world in places that matter to me. Sometimes his presence feels like a trespass that can be solved by logic and law. Sometimes it feels like a puzzle with pieces missing on purpose. My mother tells me to keep records. The police tell me to lock my doors and call if he comes onto my property. Neighbors tell me to come to them if I'm worried. I do all those things. I also sometimes find myself sitting at the window long after midnight, watching the cemetery breathe, waiting for nothing and everything. There is no neat ending to this. The last thing I can tell you is that the fear is now a part of the furniture in my life. It sits in the corner like an old armchair, and sometimes it creaks when I move. Sometimes it sits very quietly, and I almost forget it is there. Other times it tips forward, and I remember the shape of his voice, the way he said Jake, as if it were central to a ritual I had never been taught. If there is any consolation, it is this: telling the story matters. Not because it fixes things, but because it moves them out of the dark. For me, saying the name in public loosens the hold it had on my private life. For you, maybe it will be a warning or a comfort. Maybe you have your own stones you visit and your own names you whisper. Maybe you keep watch at the border of something that won't let you be insulated. I still don't know whether the man was a grieving person who had lost his mapping of names, a drifter with cracked memory, or something else whose business is to walk the borders between living things. The not knowing is the worst part, because mystery resists closure. But if I've learned anything from all of it, falling into holes, finding my house inhabited, being named in the dark, it's that cemeteries are places where the living and the other kinds of sorrow meet, and sometimes they refuse to agree on who belongs. If you spent this long with me, I appreciate it. I share this not to terrify you, but to remind you that other people hold strange stories too. If you have a cemetery story of your own, something that made a shadow feel too personal, tell it below. It helps to know you're not the only one keeping watch. If you want more late-night accounts like these, subscribe and keep an eye out. There are plenty more stories that live in the margins, and sometimes sharing them is the only gentle defense we have.